This documentary discusses territorial disputes and family separation. A single line drawn in 1947 tore apart 10 million lives in a matter of weeks. The man who drew it had never set foot in the region he was dividing, and the mistake he made would echo through 3 generations, turning neighbors into enemies and families into refugees overnight. Sir Cyril Radcliffe was a London lawyer with no experience in South Asia. In the summer of 1947, the British Empire gave him 5 weeks to partition India and create the new nation of Pakistan. Source: British Library Archives, Partition Papers. His line would determine the fate of over 400 million people across Punjab and Bengal, 2 provinces with mixed populations of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs who had lived side by side for centuries. The border was announced on August 17, 1947, 2 days after independence. By then, the violence had already begun. The map contained errors so severe that some villages were split in half, families woke up in different countries, and irrigation systems were severed from the fields they were meant to water. Source: Cambridge University Press. The Great Partition, 2007. This is the story of how a cartographer's rushed work created one of history's largest humanitarian disasters. Timeline of key events. In June 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the last British viceroy, accelerated the independence timeline from June 1948 to August 1947. Source: National Archives, UK. The decision shocked everyone, including Radcliffe himself. He arrived in New Delhi on July 8 with no staff, no interpreters, and maps that were decades out of date. His mandate was clear but impossible: draw a border that would separate Muslims from Hindus while keeping economic and administrative systems intact. Radcliffe worked from a bungalow in Delhi, relying on outdated census data from 1941. He never visited Punjab or Bengal. He never walked the villages he was dividing. His only trips to the region were brief official meetings in Lahore and Calcutta. Document: Radcliffe's personal correspondence, held at Bodleian Library. The maps he used showed political boundaries but not roads, not rivers, not the actual contours of daily life. When local officials tried to brief him on ground realities, he had already made his preliminary decisions. Pattern break. Question: how do you divide a culture with a pencil? The most controversial error occurred along the Gurdaspur district in Punjab. Radcliffe's Boundary Commission had initially recommended that Gurdaspur, with its Muslim majority, go to Pakistan. Source: Freedom at Midnight by Collins and Lapierre, citing Boundary Commission notes. But in the final map, 3 of 4 tehsils of Gurdaspur were awarded to India. This decision gave India crucial road access to Kashmir and would later become central to the Kashmir conflict that persists today. Historians have debated whether this was an error, political pressure, or intentional strategy for over 70 years. Lower third. August 1617, 1947/border announced after independence. The maps were printed and sealed but not published immediately. For 2 critical days after independence, no one knew where the border actually was. Trains crossed invisible lines. Families began migrating based on rumors. The official announcement came via All India Radio on August 17, by which point convoys of refugees were already on the move and communal violence had erupted in dozens of towns. Source: Oral Histories archived at the 1947 Partition Archive. By September, the human catastrophe was undeniable. Radcliffe himself destroyed his notes and refused payment for his work. Document: Radcliffe letter to Mountbatten, August 1947. He never returned to India. When asked about his role years later, he reportedly said, "Nobody in India will admit that any good came of my award." Source: The Shadow of the Great Game by Narendra Singh Sarila, 2006. Evidence and verification. The primary evidence of cartographic errors comes from multiple sources. The Boundary Commission's working papers show deliberations that don't match the final award in at least 8 locations. Document: Boundary Commission Proceedings, British Library. Discrepancies in Gurdaspur are documented in telegrams between Mountbatten and London, though the exact decision-making process remains classified in some file source. Declassified cabinet papers, released 1997. Survivors and witnesses provided testimony that villages like Wagga were literally cut in two, with the Grand Trunk Road becoming an international border source. 1947 Partition Archive, video testimonies. Census maps from 1941 show religious demographics that don't align with how territories were ultimately assigned in at least 14 districts source. Imperial Gazetteer cross-referenced with Radcliffe Award. The irrigation headworks of Punjab were separated from 95% of the canal systems they controlled, an engineering impossibility that Indian and Pakistani officials had to resolve through emergency water-sharing agreements. Document. Indus Waters Treaty Negotiations, 1940-81960. INFOCARD. Confirmed. Border announcement delayed versus disputed. Why Gurdaspur assignment changed. Independent cartographers who have analyzed the maps note that some borders follow no geographical logic. They cut across farms, through family compounds, and ignore natural boundaries like rivers that would have made enforcement easier source. Royal Geographical Society Analysis, 2007. Whether these were errors of haste, political interference, or both remains debated among historians. Conflicting views and gaps. Some historians argue Radcliffe was a scapegoat for an impossible task, that any border would have caused violence given the communal tensions of 1947 source. Historical Journal, Cambridge, 2012. They point to letters showing he resisted political pressure and tried to follow his mandate objectively. Others present evidence that Mountbatten directly influenced the Gurdaspur decision to favor India's strategic interest source. Indian Summer, by Alex von Tunzelmann, 2007. Mountbatten's private secretary denied this in testimony, but correspondence declassified decades later suggests multiple meetings about Kashmir access occurred during the crucial final week. Pakistani historians emphasize that Muslim-majority areas were awarded to India in ways that violated the partition principle of religious demographic source. Pakistani National Archives. Indian historians counter that economic viability and administrative coherence had to be considered, not just population ratio source. Indian Council of Historical Research Publications. Both nations have published official maps that differ slightly from Radcliffe's originals, each claiming corrections of his errors. What remains undisputed is that the timeline was catastrophically short. No modern political scientist believes a partition of this scale could be executed responsibly in 5 weeks. The gaps in the historical record, including Radcliffe's destroyed notes, mean we may never know exactly why certain decisions were made. Human impact. The human cost was immediate and staggering. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that between 1 and 2 million people died in partition violence source. Multiple academic sources. The Great Partition synthesizes estimates. 10 to 20 million people became refugees, the largest mass migration in human history at that time. Entire trains arrived at stations filled with corpses. Villages that had coexisted for centuries turned on each other in days. For the families divided by the border, the pain lasted generations. Siblings found themselves citizens of hostile nations. Property was abandoned. Marriage ties were severed. In Punjab, where the partition cut deepest, families still tell stories of grandparents who never saw their siblings again, who died not knowing if relatives on the other side had survived. The border wasn't just a line on a map. It became a scar through memory itself, through language, through the basic geography of home. The impact persists today. Millions of people on both sides trace their ancestry to the other side of the border. The territorial disputes rooted in the 1947 map, especially over Kashmir, have led to multiple wars and ongoing military standoffs. Every year, Families apply for visas to visit ancestral villages, to find graves, to close circles that were violently opened 77 years ago. Expert lens: why it matters. Cartographers today explain the 1947 errors through a simple principle. Maps are never neutral. Every line represents a choice, a prioritization, a value system. Radcliffe's maps prioritize speed and British strategic interests over lived realities. Modern border specialists point out that sustainable boundaries need local input, geographic logic, and time for communities to adjust source. International Boundaries Research Unit, Durham University. Think of it this way. Radcliffe was asked to perform surgery on a body he'd never examined, using outdated diagrams, with the patient already hemorrhaging. The tools of colonial cartography, the bird's-eye view from London, the faith that administrators could reorganize societies like files in a cabinet, all of this was the mindset that created the disaster. The mistake wasn't just in where the line was drawn. The mistake was believing any outside power could draw such a line justly in the first place. Sidebar: Partition. The division of British India into independent India and Pakistan in 1947. The legacy matters because partition became a template, both for what to do and what never to do again. When other nations have faced similar divisions, Cyprus, Korea, Ireland, the partition of India stands as a cautionary tale. It demonstrates how territorial disputes rooted in colonial decisions can perpetuate conflict for generations. It shows how maps drawn in imperial capitals, disconnected from ground truth, can destroy what they claim to organize. Mini recap. Here's what we know for certain. Radcliffe drew a border in 5 weeks with inadequate information and no field research. The border contained errors that separated communities, divided resources, and created the conditions for mass violence. What we still debate is whether the most controversial decisions were errors of haste or products of political influence. Either way, the human cost was catastrophic and continues to shape South Asian geopolitics. What happened next would prove that a mapmaker's mistake could outlive empires. The immediate what's next already happened: decades of war, frozen conflict, and generational trauma. But today, new scenarios are emerging. Digital mapping and DNA testing are helping partition families find each other across the border. Confidence. High, multiple documented cases through 1947 partition archive. Citizens' initiatives and oral history projects are preserving survivor testimonies before that generation passes. Confidence. High, active projects in India, Pakistan, and diaspora communities. Politically, the Kashmir dispute rooted in the 1947 boundaries remains unresolved, with periodic escalations. Confidence. High, ongoing. Historians continue to declassify documents, and as more archives open, we may learn definitively what influenced Radcliffe's final decisions. Confidence. Medium, dependent on government declassification schedules. The possibility of formal borders opening significantly for family reunifications remains low in the near term, given current political tensions. Confidence. Low. What's more likely is that the grassroots work continues. The documentation, the remembering, the quiet acts of connection across a border that was never meant to be permanent. The map that divided India didn't spark the violence alone. It channeled tensions that British colonial rule had inflamed for decades. But Radcliffe's rushed, flawed lines turned political conflict into geographic destiny for millions. The families separated by that map didn't make the choices that divided them. They simply woke up one day in different countries, and the world never gave them a say. If you want to understand how colonial decisions still shape modern conflicts, watch our next video on how the Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the Middle East with similarly lasting consequences. This documentary synthesizes historical research from academic sources, government archives, and survivor testimonies. Key sources include British Library partition papers, the 1947 Partition Archive Oral History Project, declassified British cabinet papers, and peer-reviewed historical scholarship published by Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, and regional academic institutions. Estimates of casualties and refugees vary among historians due to incomplete records. Ranges provided represent academic consensus. The debate over Radcliffe's decision-making process continues as new documents are periodically declassified. This script presents multiple historical perspectives and clearly distinguishes between documented facts and ongoing scholarly disputes. All interpretations favor evidence-based analysis over nationalist narratives from any side. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more amazing videos.